I accused my boyfriend of cheating, and now I deeply regret my actions. We had been dating for almost a year when we moved into a small house near his hometown. Everything felt perfect until he mentioned a yearly tradition. Every year on the same date, he flies to California for a few days. When I asked why, he got quiet and changed the subject by inviting me to come along. I had to work that week, so I said no. I knew he was a former Marine and had been stationed out there, so I figured it was just to visit old buddies or relive some memories. I didn't push it. Then something happened that made me spiral. A few days later, he was cooking dinner and left his phone charging in the living room where I was sitting. A text popped up from a name I didn't recognize. The screen was locked, but I'm ashamed to admit I had figured out his password weeks ago. It was the name of his favorite gun. Predictable. I know I shouldn't have looked, but I've been cheated on before. I trusted my ex with everything, and he destroyed me. So when I saw that text, my old wounds took over. The message said, "Don't forget, Maya's favorite beer is Buzz Light. Grab a few cases." My heart dropped. Who was Maya? Why was he buying her favorite beer for a trip he wouldn't explain to me? I closed the phone and pretended I saw nothing, but inside I was falling apart. I went to my work friends for advice, and all three of them said the same thing. He's taking another woman on a romantic getaway. He's cheating. My anxiety exploded. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how I believed he was the one, and how could he betray me like this? I decided I wasn't going to cry alone. I was going to confront him and catch him in his lies. I came home early that day. He was in the backyard fixing a broken fence post. I called out and told him to come inside. He said he'd be there in a second. I told him to come now. I heard him drop everything and run in. He probably thought I was hurt because when he saw my face, he immediately asked what was wrong. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I know you're cheating on me." He froze. Then he actually laughed a little, like I was joking. When he saw my tears, his smile disappeared. He stepped toward me, trying to hold me, but I pushed him away. He looked so confused and hurt. He stepped back and quietly asked, "What made you think I'm cheating?" I told him I knew about Maya. I said I knew he was flying out to see her next week. He nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, I am." I broke. He just admitted it. I started sobbing harder, barely able to breathe. But then he reached into his wallet and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to me and said, "That's Maya." The photo showed two Marines in full gear, arms around each other's shoulders, rifles in their free hands. One of them was my boyfriend, younger but unmistakable. The other was a woman. She had a wide smile and kind eyes. I had seen this picture before in a memorial post his friend shared online. Maya had taken her own life 3 years ago while they were deployed together. My boyfriend sat down across from me and explained everything. Every year on the anniversary of her death, he flies to California where her family lives. He visits her grave. He has dinner with her parents. He brings her favorite beer and they share stories about her. It's how they all cope. It's how they remember her. I felt like the worst person in the world. I had taken his grief and turned it into something ugly. I accused him of betrayal when he was honoring someone he lost. I started apologizing over and over, but he just sat there quietly for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "I should have told you. I just don't like talking about it. It still hurts." He wasn't angry. He was sad, and that made it worse. We talked for hours that night. He told me about Maya, about the guilt he still carries, about how hard it is to open up. I told him about my past, about the men who broke my trust, about why I assumed the worst. We both cried. We both apologized. And somewhere in that mess, we got closer than we had ever been. He still went to California the following week, but this time I asked if I could come. He said yes. I met Maya's parents. I visited her grave. I watched my boyfriend cry in a way I had never seen before. And I finally understood what he carries with him every single day. I almost destroyed the best relationship I've ever had because I let my past control me. I assumed betrayal because that's all I had ever known. But he showed me that some people are exactly who they say they are. Some silences aren't hiding lies. They're protecting wounds that haven't fully healed. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one who has let old pain poison something good. If your partner has a part of themselves they don't share easily, maybe give them time instead of suspicion. I almost lost everything by assuming the worst. I'm just grateful he gave me the chance to understand the truth. I spent the next week with my laptop open constantly, reading everything I could find about survivors' guilt and military PTSD. The articles explained how service members carry invisible wounds that don't show up on any medical scan, but affect everything they do. I read about combat trauma and what happens when someone watches their friends die, how the brain tries to process something it was never meant to handle. One article talked about how veterans often can't explain their experiences to civilians because the words don't exist for what they went through. That helped me understand why my boyfriend couldn't just mention Maya over dinner like she was some old friend from work. She wasn't a casual topic. She was a wound that never fully closed. My phone rang on Wednesday afternoon while I was reading about anniversary reactions in PTSD. Miranda's name flashed on the screen. I answered, and she asked how I was doing, her voice careful like she was checking on someone who might break. I told her everything. The accusation, the photograph, the truth about Maya, the hours of crying and talking that followed. She listened without interrupting, which isn't like her at all. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she was proud of me for admitting I was wrong and apologizing. But she also reminded me that my trust issues are real problems I need to deal with properly. She said understanding where they come from doesn't mean I get a pass for snooping through his phone or jumping to conclusions. She was right, and it stung to hear it. At work the next day, I pulled Juliana aside during lunch break. She was the one who'd been most convinced he was cheating, the one who said all the signs pointed to another woman. I told her the real story about Maya and the annual trip to visit her grave. Juliana's face went red and she looked genuinely embarrassed. She apologized for jumping to conclusions and admitted she'd been projecting her own cheating ex onto my situation. Her ex had used similar excuses about trips and old friends, so she assumed mine was doing the same thing. We both realized we'd let our past experiences cloud what was actually happening. She hugged me and said she was glad she was wrong, that my boyfriend sounded like one of the good ones. That evening, my boyfriend came home from work and found me on the couch with my laptop, reading another article about military grief. He set down his keys and asked what I was doing. I told him honestly that I was trying to understand what he'd been through, that I wanted to know more about what he carries every day. His expression softened and he sat down next to me. He seemed touched that I was making the effort, but then he warned me that reading about it isn't the same as witnessing it. He said the articles can explain the psychology and the symptoms, but they can't show me what it actually feels like to lose someone that way. I nodded and told him I knew that, but I wanted to try anyway. 3 days before we were supposed to leave for California, he pulled out his phone after dinner. He scrolled through his photos for a minute, then turned the screen toward me. Maya was goofing around on base in one picture, making a silly face at the camera. In another, she was at a barbecue with other Marines, holding a plate piled high with food. There was one of her cleaning her rifle, focused and serious. His voice stayed steady as he swiped through the images, but I watched his jaw muscles tighten with each photo. I realized he probably didn't look at these very often, that showing them to me was difficult for him. I asked if I could see more, and he kept scrolling, sharing little details about where each photo was taken or what they'd been doing that day. I asked him what Maya was like as a person, not just as a Marine. He smiled a little and told me she was funny, that she could do perfect impressions of their commanding officers that had everyone cracking up. He said she was always pulling pranks on the newer guys, nothing mean but enough to keep things interesting when deployment got boring. Then he mentioned her terrible singing voice, how she'd belt out country songs in the shower and everyone could hear her through the whole barracks. As he talked, I could see glimpses of the friendship they'd had before everything went dark. These weren't just war stories or trauma memories. These were real moments with a real person he'd cared about. The night before our flight, we were packing our bags when he stopped and sat down on the edge of the bed. He admitted he was nervous about me meeting Maya's parents. He said they're the only people who really understand what he lost, who knew Maya the way he did. I promised to be respectful and follow his lead, that I understood I was entering sacred space in their shared grief. He nodded and went back to packing, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. This trip wasn't just emotionally hard for him, it was also the first time he was bringing someone into this part of his life, and that carried its own kind of pressure. On the plane to California, he barely said a word. He stared out the window for most of the flight, watching the clouds pass below us. His knee bounced constantly, a nervous habit I'd noticed before but never this intense. I held his hand and didn't try to force conversation. I was learning that sometimes support doesn't mean filling the silence with words. Sometimes it just means being there, being present while someone works through whatever they're feeling. The flight attendant came by twice to offer drinks and snacks. We both declined. Neither of us had much appetite. When we landed and picked up our rental car, his whole demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed up and pulled back like he was bracing for something. His responses got shorter, just 1 or 2 words instead of full sentences. I realized he was already mentally preparing himself for the emotional weight of the next few days. The drive from the airport into the city felt longer than it probably was. He gripped the steering wheel tight and kept his eyes fixed on the road. I didn't try to make small talk or point out landmarks. I just let him have the space to get ready for what was coming. We stopped at a liquor store about 20 minutes from Maya's parents' house. He pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. Inside, he walked straight to the beer section without hesitation. He grabbed 3 cases of Buzz Light, stacking them in his arms like he'd done this exact thing many times before. I stood there watching him and finally understood the text message that had started my whole spiral of suspicion. This wasn't some secret romantic gesture for another woman. This was a tradition, a way of including Maya in a gathering she should have been part of. He clearly knew exactly what her parents expected him to bring each year, down to the specific brand and quantity. At the checkout counter, he paid in cash while I stood beside him holding my purse and feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me. The cashier asked if we were having a party, and my boyfriend just said something about visiting family, his voice flat and distant. We loaded the beer into the trunk and got back in the car without speaking. The drive to Maya's parents' house took us through neighborhoods that looked like any other California suburb, houses with neat lawns and 2-car garages, completely normal except for the fact that we were heading toward a place where grief lived permanently in every room. He pointed out the window at a chain-link fence surrounding a huge complex of buildings. "That's the base entrance," he said, "where we'd line up for inspection every morning at 6. His voice carried this weird mix of fondness and pain, like remembering good times that were attached to bad ones. A few blocks later, he gestured at a dive bar with a neon sign that flickered even in daylight. "We used to go there every Friday night," he said. "The whole unit crammed into those back booths getting drunk and loud. Maya always won at pool even when she was wasted." I watched his face as he talked, and saw how every memory seemed to hurt and comfort him at the same time. He turned down a street that led toward the ocean and slowed the car near a public beach access point. "We'd come here on rare days off," he said. "Just sit in the sand and not talk about anything related to the military." Maya loved the water even though she grew up landlocked in Arizona. The nostalgia in his voice made my chest tight because I understood now that this whole city was a map of memories he couldn't escape, places that would always remind him of someone who wasn't here anymore. Maya's parents lived in a small house painted pale yellow with white trim, a tidy front yard, and an American flag hanging by the door. Before we even made it up the walkway, the front door opened and a woman rushed out. She was small and gray-haired, wearing jeans and a Marine Corps t-shirt that probably belonged to Maya. She grabbed my boyfriend in a hug that looked like it might break both of them, her arms wrapped tight around him while he bent down to hold her back. Maya's father appeared in the doorway, a tall man with a military bearing even in civilian clothes, and he waited until his wife released my boyfriend before stepping forward to clap him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, son," he said, and the way he said son made it clear this wasn't just politeness, but something earned through years of shared grief. They both turned to me then, and I felt their eyes studying my face, trying to figure out exactly who I was and what I meant to their daughter's friend. Maya's mother smiled and introduced herself, shaking my hand with both of hers, her grip warm and firm. Maya's father nodded at me and said they were glad I could make it, his voice careful and measured like he was still deciding what he thought about my presence here. Inside their home, I understood immediately why my boyfriend had been nervous about bringing me. Photos of Maya covered every available surface, arranged on shelves and walls and side tables, a complete visual history of her life from infancy to the last pictures taken before she died. Baby Maya in a bathtub, toddler Maya on a tricycle, teenage Maya at prom in a blue dress, Maya in her dress blues at boot camp graduation, Maya in combat gear somewhere overseas. The house wasn't just decorated with her memory, it was built around it, every room a shrine to the daughter they'd lost. I felt the weight of their grief pressing down on me from all sides, making it hard to breathe normally. We sat in the living room and Maya's mother brought out iced tea while her father asked about our drive from the airport. My boyfriend answered in short sentences, his posture stiff and formal like he was reporting to a superior officer. I could see him struggling with something, some internal battle between wanting to be here and wanting to run away from how much it hurt. Dinner was pot roast and potatoes, comfort food that Maya's mother said was her daughter's favorite meal. We sat around a small dining table with an empty chair that nobody mentioned but everyone noticed. Maya's father asked my boyfriend about his job, about our house, about whether he was taking care of himself. My boyfriend answered honestly but kept everything brief, like he felt guilty for having a life to report on when Maya didn't. I sensed the weight of survivor's guilt in every word he spoke, the way he downplayed his own happiness as if joy was something he didn't deserve. Maya's mother turned her attention to me and asked how we met, what I did for work, the normal getting-to-know-you questions that felt completely surreal given where we were and why. I answered carefully, aware that I was evaluated not just as his girlfriend, but as someone he trusted enough to bring into this sacred annual ritual they all shared. I told them about my job, about our house, about how patient and kind he'd been with me even when I didn't deserve it. Maya's mother nodded along, and I could see her mentally checking boxes, deciding if I was good enough for the man who visited her daughter's grave every year. After dinner, Maya's father pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, gesturing for my boyfriend to follow him to the back porch. Through the kitchen window, I watched them sit in lawn chairs, their heads bent close together as they talked in voices too low for me to hear. 2 men bound by combat and loss, sharing something I'd never fully understand, no matter how many articles I read about military trauma or survivor's guilt. Their conversation looked heavy and important, the kind of talk that only happens between people who've seen the same darkness. Maya's mother and I cleaned up the kitchen together, loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters in comfortable silence. Then she said she was glad he finally brought someone with him, because she worried about him making this trip alone every year. Her kindness, despite her own devastating loss, made me feel physically sick about my accusations and suspicions, about how I'd turned his grief into evidence of betrayal. I apologized again for intruding on their family tradition, and she waved it off, saying that anyone he cared about enough to bring here was welcome in their home. We left around 9 and drove to our hotel in silence. He checked us in at the front desk while I stood beside him feeling exhausted from holding myself together for hours. In our room, he sat on the edge of the bed and started unlacing his shoes with shaking hands. I sat next to him and put my hand on his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. Then he broke. Deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and unreachable, a kind of crying I'd never witnessed from any person before. I wrapped my arms around him and held on while he fell apart, not trying to fix it or make it stop, finally understanding that some pain just needs to be felt and witnessed and survived. He cried for maybe 20 minutes, gasping for air between sobs, his whole body trembling against mine. When he could finally speak, he told me between ragged breaths that he felt guilty for being alive when Maya wasn't, guilty for finding happiness with me when she'd never have that chance. The survivor's guilt was so heavy and irrational and completely consuming, and I realized he'd been carrying this weight alone for 3 years, without letting anyone see how much it crushed him. He kept apologizing for crying, for bringing me here, for being a mess, and I kept telling him to stop apologizing for being human. Then he started talking about Maya in a way he never had before, explaining that she'd been struggling for months before she died. There were signs everyone missed or didn't take seriously enough, jokes about not wanting to be here anymore that people laughed off as dark humor. He blamed himself for not checking on her more, for not insisting she talk to someone, for not somehow preventing what felt inevitable in hindsight even though nobody could have known for sure. I told him everything. About the messages I found on my ex's phone that he swore were just work. About the way he made me feel crazy for months, saying I was paranoid and jealous when my gut knew something was wrong. I described coming home early one day and finding proof I couldn't deny anymore. The confrontation where he actually blamed me for pushing him into someone else's arms. My boyfriend listened without interrupting, his breathing steady in the darkness. When I finished, I told him I knew my past wasn't his fault, but it's why I saw betrayal in a text about beer instead of grief. It's why I accused him of cheating when he was just honoring someone he lost. He was quiet for a long time before he started talking about how he's been keeping parts of himself locked away because he didn't want to drag me into his darkness. He explained that he tells people he's fine when he's not, that he pretends the nightmares don't still wake him up sweating and disoriented. I admitted I've been searching for signs of betrayal in everything he does because expecting the worst feels safer than being blindsided again. We kept talking as the room grew lighter, neither of us sleeping, both of us finally saying things we'd been too scared to voice. He confessed he's been protecting me from his worst days by withdrawing instead of letting me see him struggle. I told him I've been testing his loyalty in small ways without realizing it, looking for cracks that would prove my fears right. When morning came, the heaviness was immediate. He moved through getting dressed like his body was on autopilot while his mind was somewhere else entirely. His face had gone blank in a way that scared me more than the crying, like he'd shut down every emotion to get through what came next. I got ready quietly, not sure what to say or if saying anything would help. We checked out of the hotel and drove to Maya's parents' house, where they were waiting on the front porch with flowers already in hand. The 4 of us got into their car, my boyfriend and I in the back seat with the cases of Buzz Light beer stacked between us. Nobody spoke during the 20-minute drive to the cemetery. The silence felt thick and suffocating, like the air itself was carrying the weight of what this day meant to all of them. I watched the scenery pass by the window, normal people doing normal things on a day that felt anything but normal. The military cemetery stretched out in every direction when we arrived, thousands of identical white headstones arranged in perfect rows across immaculate grass. We parked and walked through the grounds, following a path Maya's parents clearly knew by heart. The headstones blurred together until we stopped at one that looked exactly like all the others except for the name carved into it. Maya's full name, her rank, the dates that marked the beginning and end of her life. Her father knelt down and placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, while her mother set up a small framed photo of Maya in her uniform, smiling at whoever took the picture. My boyfriend stood completely still, staring at the grave with an expression of such raw pain that I had to look away to keep from crying. His jaw was clenched tight and his hands were fists at his sides, like he was physically holding himself together. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Maya's father opened one of the beers and poured it slowly onto the grass in front of the headstone, the liquid soaking into the ground. Her mother opened another and did the same, a ritual that felt both simple and incredibly meaningful. My boyfriend took the third beer with shaking hands and poured it out, his lips moving silently like he was saying something only Maya could hear. They each took beers for themselves and stood there drinking in silence for a few minutes. The four of us gathered around a grave like we were including her in the moment. Then her father started talking about basic training, about how Maya convinced another recruit to help her prank their drill sergeant by hiding all his whistles. Everyone laughed softly through their tears as he described the sergeant's face when he couldn't find a single whistle anywhere. My boyfriend added that Maya almost got kicked out for that stunt but somehow charmed her way out of serious punishment, and I could hear the fondness in his voice mixed with the grief. More stories came after that, each one painting a clearer picture of who Maya had been. Her mother talked about Maya's attempts at cooking that were so bad everyone learned to eat before coming to her place. My boyfriend told a story about Maya winning a poker tournament on base and trash-talking guys twice her size. Her father described the time Maya won a push-up contest against the entire platoon, refusing to quit even when her arms were shaking. They passed around more beers and kept talking, sharing memories that made Maya feel alive and present and real, which somehow made her absence feel even more crushing. My boyfriend stepped closer to the headstone and dropped to one knee in the grass. His hand reached out and touched the carved letters of Maya's name, fingers tracing each one slowly like he was trying to connect with her through the stone. He started talking in a voice so quiet I could barely hear him at first. He told Maya about me, about how we met, about how scared he'd been to let someone in again after losing her. His voice cracked when he said he was sorry for taking 3 years to bring someone to meet her, sorry for being afraid she'd think he was replacing her or forgetting what she meant to him. He promised her parents he'd keep coming back every single year, that he wouldn't let her be forgotten no matter how much time passed or how his life changed. The raw pain in his voice made my chest hurt, so badly I had to press my hand against it just to breathe. Tears were streaming down his face, but he kept talking to her like she could hear him, like she was right there listening to everything he needed to say. He told her he missed her every day, and that the guilt of surviving when she didn't still woke him up at night sometimes. Watching him break down at her grave made me understand what he meant about carrying this every single day. This wasn't old grief that had healed over with time and distance. This was fresh and aching and right beneath the surface of everything he did, a constant companion he'd learned to function around but never truly escaped. He got up after a few minutes and just stood there staring at her name with tears running down his face, his jaw clenched tight like he was trying to hold himself together. Maya's mother moved closer to me and put her arm around my shoulders. She spoke quietly so only I could hear, telling me she was grateful he had me now, that Maya would want him to be happy and loved. The generosity of her words given her own loss hit me hard. Here was a woman who'd buried her daughter, who came to this cemetery every year to pour beer on her grave, and she was worried about whether her daughter's friend had someone to love him. I started crying for the first time since we'd arrived at the cemetery, tears falling so fast I couldn't stop them. She squeezed my shoulder and didn't say anything else, just stood there with me while we both watched my boyfriend grieve for the woman he couldn't save. We stayed at the graveside for over an hour, nobody wanting to be the first one to suggest leaving. The afternoon sun felt too bright and normal for how heavy everything felt, like the world should somehow acknowledge what we were carrying, but instead just kept going like any other day. People walked dogs on the paths between headstones and birds sang in the trees and cars drove past on the road outside the cemetery gates. Finally, Maya's father said we should probably head back to the house before it got too late. We walked to the car in complete silence, emotionally wrung out and exhausted in a way that went deeper than just being tired. My boyfriend held my hand so tight it almost hurt, but I didn't pull away because I could feel how much he needed the connection. Back at Maya's parents' house, we sat in their living room surrounded by photos of their daughter everywhere I looked. The walls were covered with pictures from every stage of her life, and the shelves held framed photos of her in uniform, with friends, at family gatherings. We shared more memories over sandwiches that Maya's mother had made, but nobody really ate. The conversation drifted between past and present, laughter and tears, following the natural rhythm of grief that doesn't follow any logical pattern. One minute, Maya's father was laughing about the time she convinced her entire unit to wear their uniforms backward for a group photo as a prank, and the next minute he was crying into his hands. My boyfriend told a story about Maya teaching herself guitar by watching videos online and how she'd play the same 3 chords over and over until everyone wanted to throw her guitar off the roof. Maya's mother laughed and said she still had that guitar in the closet, that she couldn't bring herself to get rid of it even though nobody played it anymore. Then Maya's father stood up and said he wanted to play something. He went to the closet and pulled out Maya's old guitar, the same one from all the stories. He sat back down and started playing a song, his voice rough but steady as he sang. My boyfriend closed his eyes listening, and I watched tears stream down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. He was finally letting himself feel everything in front of people who understood, people who wouldn't judge him or tell him to move on, or ask why he wasn't over it yet. The song ended and nobody spoke for a while. As evening started to approach and the light through the windows turned golden, Maya's mother stood up and asked if she could talk to me privately. We went into the kitchen together and she turned to face me with tears in her eyes. She thanked me for coming, for supporting him through this, for being patient with his grief. She told me he'd been alone with this for too long and she was relieved he'd finally trusted someone enough to share it. She said she could see how much he loved me, and that gave her hope he might actually heal someday, instead of just surviving. I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her and we both cried in her kitchen while the men sat in the living room with Maya's memory all around them. Before we left for our hotel, I surprised everyone by asking if I could have a moment at Maya's grave alone. They all looked at me with confused expressions, but agreed. My boyfriend drove me back to the cemetery and waited in the car while I walked to her headstone by myself. The sun was setting now, and the cemetery was almost empty. I stood in front of Maya's grave and felt awkward at first, talking to someone I'd never met. But then I started speaking out loud even though I never knew her. I apologized for my jealousy and suspicion, for turning her memory into something ugly in my mind. I promised to take care of him, and to never make him feel guilty for grieving her, to understand that loving me doesn't mean forgetting her, or moving on from his pain. I told her headstone that I almost destroyed something good because I couldn't see past my own trauma. I explained that my ex had cheated on me and destroyed my ability to trust anyone, and when I saw her name in that text message, I let all my old wounds take over. I was grateful for the chance to understand the truth instead of losing him over my assumptions. I promised to honor her memory by being worthy of the trust he'd placed in me, by doing my own healing work so my past doesn't poison our future. I stood there for a few more minutes just looking at her name carved in stone, thinking about how she'd never get to fall in love or buy a house or grow old. Then I walked back to the car where my boyfriend was waiting. He drove us back to the hotel in silence, and I watched the California streets pass by outside the window. The sun had set completely now, and streetlights made everything look orange and strange. When we got to the parking lot, he turned off the engine but didn't move to get out of the car. He just sat there with his hands still on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I waited because I didn't know what to say after everything I'd just witnessed at the cemetery. Finally, he took a deep breath and opened his door. We walked across the parking lot to our room, and the whole time I could feel the weight of the day pressing down on both of us. Inside the hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands. I sat down next to him and put my hand on his back. He leaned into me and wrapped his arms around my waist, holding me tight like I might disappear if he let go. He pulled back just enough to look at me, and his eyes were red and tired. He said he was grateful I came with him this year because he'd been making this trip alone for so long and it hurt every single time. He told me he'd been scared to let me see this side of him because most people don't know how to handle grief this big. They get uncomfortable, or they try to fix it, or they tell him he needs to move on already. He was afraid I'd think he was broken or too damaged to love properly. I told him I understood now why he couldn't just casually mention this over dinner. This wasn't something you bring up like talking about the weather or what you did last weekend. I said loving someone means seeing all of them, including the parts that hurt and the parts that are still healing. His grief didn't scare me anymore because I finally understood what it was and where it came from. We talked for hours that night about how we both needed to work on healing ourselves while also being there for each other. He admitted he goes to counseling through the VA, but he hasn't been totally honest with his therapist about how much he still struggles. He said he shows up to appointments and talks about surface-level stuff, but never really digs into the guilt he carries about surviving when Maya didn't. I asked him why he holds back in therapy, and he said it feels easier to just manage the pain than to actually work through it. I told him that wasn't fair to himself, and it wasn't really healing if he was just keeping everything locked down. He nodded and said he knew I was right, and he'd try to be more open in his next session. Then I took a breath and admitted I needed to find my own therapist to deal with my trust issues. I told him it wasn't fair to him or to me that I was still operating from a place of fear and suspicion because of what my ex did years ago. He said he supported that completely and offered to help me find someone good. We made a promise to each other right there in that hotel room to be more honest about our triggers and our wounds. He said he'd share more about his hard days instead of withdrawing and shutting down. I promised to voice my anxieties when they came up instead of letting them spiral into accusations and paranoia. The next morning, we checked out of the hotel and drove to the airport. The flight home felt completely different from the flight there. We were both exhausted and didn't talk much, but there was something new between us now. We'd seen each other's deepest wounds and messiest parts, and we'd both chosen to stay. We'd chosen to work on healing together while also doing our own individual work. When we landed and drove back to our house, I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. I noticed things I'd walked past 100 times before but never really paid attention to. In his closet, there was a Marine Corps flag folded in a perfect triangle sitting on the top shelf. On his dresser was a challenge coin that I'd always thought was just some random keepsake. The way he organized his space with everything in its exact place wasn't just him being neat. It was military precision drilled into him from years of service. These weren't just quirks anymore, but pieces of an identity shaped by experiences I'd never fully understand. A few days after we got back, I was in the kitchen making coffee when his phone buzzed on the counter next to me. I felt that old familiar urge rise up in my chest to grab it and check who was texting him. My hand actually moved toward the phone before I caught myself and pulled it back. The fear and suspicion were still there living inside me like they always had been. But now I had the awareness to recognize it as my trauma talking instead of truth. I stepped away from the counter and took a few deep breaths until the urge passed. That night, I sat at my laptop and started researching therapists who specialized in trust issues and past relationship trauma. I read through profiles and reviews for over an hour looking for someone who seemed like a good fit. I needed someone who wouldn't just tell me to get over it or that I was being unreasonable. I needed someone who understood that betrayal leaves actual scars that don't just fade because time passes. Making the appointment felt like taking responsibility for my own healing instead of expecting my boyfriend to fix damage someone else caused. My first session was 2 weeks later in a small office downtown. The therapist's name was Gage, and he had kind eyes and asked me to tell him why I was there. I started talking about my ex and the cheating, and suddenly I was crying harder than I'd cried in months. Talking about it brought up feelings I thought I'd dealt with years ago, but clearly I'd just buried them. Gage listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he helped me see that I'd been protecting myself by assuming betrayal before it could happen. I'd been staying alert and watching for signs of cheating so I'd never be blindsided again like I was with my ex. But that constant watching and suspicion was costing me the chance at real closeness with someone who actually deserved my trust. Around the same time I started my therapy work, my boyfriend made a change too. He started going to his VA counseling appointments every week instead of once a month like he'd been doing before. The first few times he came home afterward, he looked wiped out. His eyes were red and his shoulders sagged like he'd been carrying heavy boxes all day. He'd drop his keys on the counter and head straight to the bedroom without saying much. I'd follow him in and find him lying on the bed staring at the ceiling. When I asked if he wanted to talk about it, he'd shake his head and say he just needed to process everything. But after a few weeks of regular sessions, something shifted. He started telling me small pieces of what he discussed with his therapist. He'd mentioned that they talked about Maya and the guilt he carried about not seeing the signs before she died. He'd explained that his counselor was helping him understand that survivor's guilt was normal, but also something he needed to work through instead of just carrying forever. One night after a particularly hard session, he sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands and told me it felt good to finally stop pretending he was fine. He said he'd been holding everything in for 3 years, acting like he'd moved on and processed it all, when really he'd just gotten better at hiding how much he still hurt. Hearing him admit that made me realize how much strength it took for him to show up to those appointments week after week and actually do the work instead of just going through the motions. Things felt like they were moving in a good direction for both of us until one evening about 6 weeks after California. He was supposed to be home from work at 6, but 7 o'clock came and went with no text or call. By 7:30, I was pacing the living room, checking my phone every 2 minutes. My chest felt tight and my hands were shaking as old fears crept back in. By 8 o'clock, I'd convinced myself something was wrong. He was avoiding me or lying about where he was, or maybe he'd decided this whole thing was too much work, and he was done. When he finally walked through the door at 8:15, I was sitting on the couch with my arms crossed and tears streaming down my face. He stopped in the doorway looking confused and asked what was wrong. I stood up and my voice came out harsh and accusing when I said he'd been gone for over 2 hours without any explanation. I told him it felt like he was avoiding me on purpose. He put his hands up and said he wasn't avoiding anyone, but his tone was defensive and sharp. He said he needed space sometimes and I couldn't expect him to report his every move. That made me angrier because it felt like he was twisting what I'd said. I shot back that asking for a simple text wasn't the same as demanding he report his every move. He raised his voice and said he didn't realize he needed permission to stay late at work. We were suddenly standing in our living room yelling at each other, both of us hurt and angry and falling right back into old patterns of miscommunication. But then something different happened. He stopped mid-sentence and took a deep breath. He walked over and sat down on the couch, and after a second, I sat down too. We were both quiet for a minute, both of us breathing hard and trying to calm down. He spoke first, and his voice was quieter when he said he was sorry for not calling. He explained that he'd gotten caught up in a project at work and completely lost track of time. It wasn't that he was avoiding me or trying to stay away. He just genuinely forgot to check his phone or send a message. He said he understood why that made me anxious given everything we'd been through, but it wasn't intentional or meaningful beyond him being forgetful. I wiped my eyes and admitted I'd jumped to the worst conclusion without any real reason. I told him I felt insecure earlier that day for no particular reason, and when he was late, it triggered all my old fears about being lied to and cheated on. I said none of that was actually about him or anything he'd done wrong. It was about me and my past trauma making me assume betrayal when there wasn't any. We sat there and talked through what had just happened using things we were both learning in our therapy sessions. It was messy and uncomfortable, and neither of us felt great about how we'd handled it. But we worked through it together instead of shutting down or walking away or letting it turn into something bigger and more damaging. We both apologized again and talked about what we could do differently next time. He said he'd set a reminder on his phone to text me if he was going to be more than 30 minutes late. I said I'd try to pause before assuming the worst and actually ask him what was going on instead of building a story in my head. When we finally went to bed that night, we both felt closer instead of more distant. The fight had been scary because it showed we could still fall into old patterns, but working through it showed we were both committed to doing things differently. The following weekend, Miranda drove up to visit. She showed up Saturday morning with coffee and bagels, and we sat at the kitchen table while I filled her in on everything. I told her about the California trip and meeting Maya's parents and visiting the grave. I explained how my boyfriend had broken down crying and shared things with me he'd never told anyone. I talked about starting therapy with Gage and how hard it was to dig into the betrayal from my ex. I mentioned the fight my boyfriend and I had about him being late, and how we'd managed to work through it instead of letting it explode. Miranda listened to everything, and when I finished, she said she was proud of me for doing the actual work, instead of just saying I would. But then she leaned forward and her expression got more serious. She said she was glad I was making progress, but she also wanted to make sure I wasn't letting myself off the hook too easily. She reminded me that understanding where my trust issues came from didn't mean I got a pass for how I'd acted. She pointed out that I'd violated my boyfriend's privacy by figuring out his password and reading his texts, and I'd accused him of something horrible based on one message I didn't understand. She said the fact that I had trauma from my ex didn't excuse those choices. It explained them, but it didn't make them okay. Hearing her say it so directly stung, but I knew she was right. I'd been so focused on the revelation about Maya and our emotional breakthrough that I hadn't fully reckoned with my own actions. I'd invaded his privacy and made terrible accusations based on my own fears, rather than any actual evidence. Miranda wasn't trying to make me feel bad. She was trying to make sure I took real responsibility, instead of just understanding why I did what I did. A few days after Miranda left, my boyfriend brought up the idea of me meeting Luca. He explained that Luca was one of his Marine buddies who'd also known Maya and struggled with similar survivor's guilt. Luca and his wife Beatrice lived about an hour away, and my boyfriend thought it might be good for all of us to get together. He said hearing Luca talk openly about his therapy and PTSD might make him feel less alone in his own struggles. We set up dinner at our place for the following Friday. When they arrived, Luca was tall and broad-shouldered with a quiet intensity about him. Beatrice was warm and friendly, hugging both of us like we were old friends even though we'd never met. We made pasta and sat around our small dining table, and the conversation started light with talk about jobs and the weather and normal getting-to-know-you stuff. But as dinner went on and we opened a second bottle of wine, the conversation shifted. Luca started talking about his therapy journey without any prompting, like it was just a normal topic of conversation. He mentioned his PTSD diagnosis and the medication he was on, and the weekly sessions with his counselor. He talked about nightmares and hypervigilance and how hard it was to feel safe even in his own home sometimes. My boyfriend listened intently, nodding along, and I could see his whole body relax as Luca spoke. When Luca mentioned the guilt he carried about Marines who didn't make it home, my boyfriend jumped in and said he felt the exact same way about Maya. The two of them talked back and forth about survivor's guilt and the irrational feeling that they should have been able to prevent deaths that weren't their fault or responsibility. Watching them share this openly made me realize how isolated my boyfriend must have felt, carrying all of this alone for so long. After dinner, Beatrice asked if I wanted to help her with dessert in the kitchen. Once we were alone, she turned to me and her expression became more serious. She told me that supporting a partner with combat trauma was hard work that required a lot of patience and clear boundaries. She was honest about the challenges in a way that felt both helpful and slightly scary. She talked about the nightmares Luca had where he'd wake up yelling or crying or not knowing where he was. She mentioned the times he'd withdraw emotionally and shut down for days, unable to talk about what he was feeling. She explained how anniversary reactions worked, how certain dates or sounds or smells could trigger him back to traumatic moments without warning. She said there were times she felt like she was walking on eggshells, trying to be supportive while also protecting her own mental health. But then her expression softened, and she said that despite all the challenges, the depth of connection possible when both people committed to healing was unlike anything she'd experienced in previous relationships. She told me that Luca's willingness to be vulnerable and do the therapy work had made their relationship stronger than it would have been without those struggles. She said the key was both of them doing their own individual work, while also supporting each other, maintaining boundaries so his trauma didn't become her trauma. Her honesty was refreshing and a little overwhelming, but it helped me understand what I might be signing up for long-term with my boyfriend. The next week in therapy, Gage and I worked through specific memories of my ex's betrayal. He had me describe the timeline of events leading up to discovering the cheating, and as I talked through it, I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before. My ex had been distant and secretive for months before I found proof, but when I'd asked him about it, he'd made me feel crazy for being suspicious. He'd accused me of being paranoid and controlling, turning my legitimate concerns back on me until I doubted my own instincts. Gage helped me understand that my ex had been gaslighting me, making me question my own perception of reality so I wouldn't trust what I was seeing. That betrayal of my trust and my sense of reality had damaged me even more than the actual cheating. It explained why I'd been so quick to doubt myself with my current boyfriend, why I'd felt like I needed concrete proof before trusting my gut. But Gage also helped me see that my current boyfriend was nothing like my ex. When I'd confronted him about Maya, he hadn't tried to make me feel crazy or turn it back on me. He'd been sad and hurt, but he'd explained everything honestly. He'd shown me the photo and told me the truth even though it was painful to talk about. Gage gave me concrete tools to use when anxiety spiked, like pausing to ask myself what evidence I actually had before jumping to conclusions. He taught me to identify the physical sensations of anxiety in my body, so I could recognize when my trauma was triggered versus when I was responding to actual present danger. Having these specific techniques made me feel less helpless against my own fears. My boyfriend and I started doing weekly check-ins on Sunday evenings. We'd sit on the couch with tea and take turns sharing how we were doing emotionally, what we were struggling with, and what we needed from each other. The first few times felt awkward and forced, like we were reading from a script. But after a few weeks, it became a space I actually looked forward to. He'd tell me about hard moments at work, or things that came up in his VA counseling, and I'd share what I was working on with Gage, or times I'd felt anxious during the week. We'd talk about what we needed from each other, like him asking for space on certain evenings, or me asking for extra reassurance when I was feeling insecure. The check-ins helped us address small issues before they became big problems, and they created a regular space for vulnerability that didn't require a crisis to happen first. It felt like we were building new patterns of communication that were healthier than anything either of us had experienced in past relationships. Then during a session with Gage about 2 months into therapy, I had a breakthrough that shifted something fundamental in how I saw myself. We were talking about my ex's cheating again, and Gage asked me why I thought he'd done it. I started to give my usual answer about not being enough or not meeting his needs, but Gage stopped me. He asked me to think about it differently. He said my ex had made a choice to cheat, and that choice reflected his character and values, not my worth as a partner. He pointed out that plenty of people have unmet needs in relationships, and they don't cheat. They communicate or go to therapy or end the relationship honestly. My ex had chosen deception and betrayal because that's who he was, not because I was insufficient or unlovable. Hearing Gage say it so plainly made something click in my brain. I'd been carrying this belief for years that I needed to be perfect and hypervigilant to prevent future betrayal. Like if I could just be enough and watch carefully enough, I could control whether someone cheated on me. But that belief gave my ex's choices power over my entire sense of self. It made his betrayal about my inadequacy instead of his character. Realizing that his cheating wasn't about me being insufficient or unlovable started to loosen the grip of the fear that had been controlling me. I couldn't prevent betrayal by being perfect or watching carefully. I could only choose partners with integrity and trust myself to recognize red flags. And my current boyfriend had shown me over and over that he had integrity, even when it was hard, even when the truth was painful to share. A few weeks after that conversation with Gage about my ex's choices, I'm sitting in our living room when my boyfriend's phone buzzes on the coffee table. The screen lights up with a text from someone named Derek. I glance at it without thinking, then realize I don't feel the usual spike of anxiety. My hands don't reach for the phone. My mind doesn't start spinning worst-case scenarios about who Derek might be or what the message could mean. I just sit there, staring at the phone until the screen goes dark again, and notice the absence of that familiar panic. The compulsion that used to control me is just gone, like a switch flipped somewhere in my brain. When my boyfriend comes back from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea, I tell him his phone went off. He picks it up, reads the message, and mentions casually that Derek wants to grab lunch next week. I nod and take my tea, feeling this quiet victory settle in my chest. The therapy work is actually changing something fundamental in how I respond to triggers. I'm not just managing my anxiety better. I'm becoming someone who doesn't automatically assume betrayal when a phone buzzes. That weekend, we're sitting at the kitchen table with our laptops, looking at flights for next year's California trip. He scrolls through dates and prices while I pretend to work on emails, but really I'm just watching him. His face is relaxed in a way it never is when he talks about Maya or the anniversary. He finds a good fare and adds it to his cart, then looks up at me with this expression I can't quite read. He asks if I'd be comfortable staying with Maya's parents instead of getting a hotel this time. The question catches me off guard. I know what he's really asking. He wants to bring me deeper into this tradition, to make me part of the annual ritual instead of just an observer. Maya's parents have their own guest room and they've mentioned it before, but he's always declined. Now he's ready to say yes, which means he's ready to integrate me fully into this piece of his life that used to be separate. I tell him I'd love that, and I mean it. The fact that he's making space for me in the painful parts, not just the easy ones, feels like something important shifting between us. He reaches across the table and squeezes my hand, then goes back to booking the flights like it's no big deal, but I can see the relief in his shoulders. A few days later, he comes home from his VA counseling session and sits down on the couch next to me. He's quiet for a minute, staring at his hands. Then he tells me his therapist said something that's been rattling around in his head all afternoon. She helped him see that honoring Maya's memory doesn't require him to stay frozen in grief. That Maya would want him to heal and be happy, not spend the rest of his life carrying guilt like a weight he can never put down. He says it out loud like he's testing the words, seeing if they feel true. He's starting to forgive himself for surviving when she didn't, recognizing that his guilt doesn't actually honor her or help anyone. It just keeps him stuck in the worst moment of his life, reliving it every day. I watch his face as he talks and see something different there. Not the absence of pain, but maybe the beginning of acceptance that the pain doesn't have to define everything. He tells me he's been so afraid of moving forward because it felt like forgetting her, like her death would matter less if he stopped hurting so much. But his therapist asked him what Maya would say if she could see him now, and he knows she'd tell him to stop punishing himself. She'd want him to live, not just exist. That night after he falls asleep, I sit at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and start writing a letter to my ex. I pour out everything I've been carrying for years. The anger at his lies and betrayal, the hurt of being made to feel like I wasn't enough, the damage he did to my ability to trust anyone after him. I write about how he gaslit me when I questioned him, made me feel crazy for my suspicions even though my instincts were right. I tell him about the years I spent assuming every man would eventually do what he did, how his choices poisoned every relationship I tried to have after him. The words come out messy and raw, my handwriting getting harder to read as emotions take over. I fill 3 pages front and back, not editing or censoring, just letting it all spill onto the paper. When I finally finish, my hand is cramping and my face is wet with tears I didn't realize I was crying. I read through what I wrote once, then take the pages outside to the fire pit in our backyard. I light them with a match and watch the paper curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash and smoke. The flames eat through my anger and hurt, destroying the power I've been giving him for so long. It feels like releasing something I've been holding too tight for too long. When the last piece burns away, I go back inside and wash my face, feeling lighter than I have in years. 6 months after the California trip, we're both in different places than we were. He's managing his PTSD with regular therapy and medication that actually helps with the nightmares and anxiety. I'm rebuilding my ability to trust through consistent work with Gage, learning to recognize when my past trauma is talking versus when something is actually wrong. We still have hard days where his grief hits him out of nowhere, or my insecurities flare up over nothing. We still have triggers that catch us off guard, moments where we slip back into old patterns of shutting down or assuming the worst. But now we face those moments together with honesty and compassion, instead of fear and suspicion. When he has a bad night, he tells me instead of withdrawing. When I feel anxious about something, I voice it instead of letting it spiral into accusations. We're building something real on a foundation of shared vulnerability and mutual healing, both of us doing our individual work while also supporting each other. It's not perfect or easy, but it's honest. And after everything we've been through, honest feels like more than enough. All right, that's all I've got today. Thanks for letting me share this little moment with you. I hope it sits with you in a good way.